All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. So it's time for the monthly OPEC oil production levels update, starting with still the largest producer in the group, Saudi Arabia, who could and did maintain a plateau of about 10 million barrels per day, usually or up around that area, but has constantly been keeping themselves down even outside of production cuts and has been the one issuing the orders to constantly, up until this point, continue the production cuts because they want to keep themselves down more at 9 so that they can push their end of plateau capability date out a bit further. The rough end of their ability to maintain a 10 plus million barrel per day plateau framework coming around the early 2030s or so. And we'll have to wait and see if they do keep to what they said they did before the group announced the end of the production cuts, which were all but cuts in name only. We'll get to that in a second. Saudi Arabia did publicly state that they would be continuing their own voluntary production cuts indefinitely. So, for the last few years, they've been holding around 9 million barrels per day or a bit under it, usually between 8.9 and 9 now, coming in there again at this time at 8.96 million barrels per day. Algeria, one of the only other two members of the group who has actually been still following those orders and obeying the production cuts. The obedience list, so to speak, was down to just them and Kuwait, and obviously Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is the one issuing the orders, so they don't exactly count on their own list. So when you're down to a point where only two out of a group of 10 or so subordinates are actually listening to you anymore, it's kind of just a facade at that point. Algeria, as one of the only two members still obeying, had hit their highest point, their peak, back in the 2000s at about 1.4 million barrels per day, and they declined down from that down to a capability area of about 1 or 1.1. However, they have held off capability wise from declining further there as they've done some enhanced recovery operations and added a few small new fields. However, because of their obedience to the production cuts, they've been told to constantly stay down at around 900,000 for the last few years, which they have done. And they are still there this time, 909,000 barrels per day. Libya, over the last 2 years or so, has been gradually managing to restore the production capacity they lost during the civil wars off and on years through the 2010s, and because of their eagerness to get back up towards 2 million barrels per day and get an actual sizable national income, they would not be listening to any limits that anyone tried to impose on them. And after being stuck at around 1.1 for a while, they have, over the last couple of years, managed to restore themselves now back up to 1.4. And they came in once again, this time right at 1.4 million barrels per day. Nigeria once held around 2 for a while, and they are still capable of doing so if everything were intact, but it's not, as they, over the last decade or more, suffered from terrorist attacks, degradation to their oil pipeline network from various theft rings and criminal operations, and just internal corruption and mishandling of money that was meant to be reinvested into maintenance and upkeep of the oil and gas infrastructure, which never actually was spent on such. So they had been degraded all the way down to close to 1.3 in their capabilities, and under the most recent, before the cuts were ended, OPEC rules, they were told to just stay down at 1.3 even if they did restore capacity, and they jumped on the boat of people who are not listening to the orders anymore, as soon as they did repair some stuff and restore some capacity, they jumped right upwards with that capacity up to around 1.5, and they were up there for a few months until now they've had some new issues and dropped down to 1.41. The UAE was not really listening from the very beginning, and they had normally maintained a 3 million barrel per day plateau, but they've wanted to go to a 4 million barrel per day plateau, even though they would be able to maintain that for less time. But since their domestic oil consumption, their own internal oil demand is up to 1.2 million barrels per day themselves now, they kind of want to go up to 4 to have a larger export ratio. And they were supposed to be down at 2.7 or 2.8 up until this point, and they were constantly holding between 2.9 and 3 instead. And a few weeks back, when the actual OPEC members' compliant report card, so to speak, came out, it was observed that they were well and beyond not really following the actual scheme, as they had already cranked their production up to about 3.3 million barrels per day. And while they're still publicly claiming that they're following the rules just like anyone else, actual observations of oil flowing out from the UAE have shown that they are still pretty close to that, but it looks like they are down a bit from last time, so probably more around 3.2. Kuwait, as I mentioned, was the one other non-Saudi member that was still following the orders, and they had held a plateau at about 3 until the production cuts came in, and they were down at around 2.6. But a number of months back, sometime last year, they were asked to go further down to 2.4, probably to compensate for the disobedience of other members. So they've been staying at 2.4 and are still there now, coming in at 2.41 million barrels per day. Iraq could be up at 5 or more now, but under the production cuts, they were constantly told to stay down at about 3.8. They never really listened to that, though, and they continued with this pattern off and on of going up to about 4.4, then seemingly acting like they were going to actually follow the orders, and they would go down to either 4.1 or a flat 4 before abruptly U-turning and going back up to 4.4 again. They were at the bottom of one of those cycles when the production cuts were ended, so they're at around 4. Iran once held a plateau of about 6, was never able to restore that completely after the revolution, only got back up to about 4, and they held around 4, usually pretty consistent, except when, stuff happened. And under the later 2010 sanctions, they were forbidden from exporting to anyone, so they had to cut their production down to only their domestic demand levels, which was a bit under 2 million barrels per day. But as the sanctions started getting let go, they began bringing their production back up as high as they could, and they have seemingly topped out around 3.3, as a lot of their fields are past maturity and are, with some being in their decline phase, and those that are not needing a lot of natural gas reinjection to keep them pressurized, which has caused issues. And so they've only been able to restore themselves back up to around 3.3, this time coming in specifically at 3.34 million barrels per day. Venezuela, once up around 3 in previous times, they declined down when the country collapsed in the later 2010s down to only around 400,000 barrels per day. With primarily the help of Chevron, they were able to restore a lot of stuff up until just now. They have made it up to 1.05 million barrels per day. However, the current U.S. administration has now forbidden Chevron from continuing to help Venezuela, so Venezuela's production is probably about to crash down again. And two small members, Gabon, who had declined down to around 180, but has gotten back up to around 220 or 230 after the addition of some modest new offshore fields. They came in this time at 222,000 barrels per day. And the smaller of the two Congos, not the giant unstable Civil War Congo, but the smaller stable oil producing Congo, he is continuing to hold out in the mid 200s, this time coming in at 263,000 barrels per day. That's it for this one. Thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal, Patreon, YouTube membership button stuff, that's all down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. There's a link in the description to a Google Drive with these graphs and all kinds of other graphs available about all kinds of stuff. That's free to access, free to use. It's there 24/7. There's also a link to my photography Instagram and a link in the top pinned comment to my cat's YouTube channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.